All right, we're going to talk about optimizing soil fertility and pastures for pastures and hay, and basically I was asked to talk about vitality and productivity, so that's what we're going to try to do here. Just a couple of comments, and that is this is a forage production company in that's a client of ours, and they started out and said they had trouble with production. Well, in terms of their production, it's a goat dairy, and it's a certified organic goat dairy, and they went from I don't remember the actual ton, but they said we got up to 10 tons per acre in terms of our forage production for remember they grow year round, but I just put that in there. And then just so you'd all be sure and have something to criticize me and say Neal can't know what he's talking about. Modesto, California, this is a client that I first visited in the mid-1990s. He's a dairyman. He really does grow 48 tons per acre of corn silage, and all the seed corn companies and so forth want to have demonstrations on his farm because he's able to do this consistently. The reason I got to visit him is because they had so much manure that they were having problems. We came in and looked at it, and they were putting all their dairy manure on their farm, and it was way too much. The phosphorus and potassium was out the roof. And what got his attention was when I said, well, don't you have breeding problems and foot problems? Because this phosphorus was tying up the zinc, and so high that it actually could affect copper. There's not a lot of research in that, but corn does have trouble getting enough copper when you have high phosphate. And then the other part was the potassium was so high it was tying up manganese. When we said you got to stop using all that manure, he said we can't. We got to do it. Because everybody else around was using manure too. Well, what we started doing was, I said earlier, I don't know how to get phosphate out of a soil except to grow it out. So what we started having them do is every year they grew corn silage, they put the manure on. That would be 2 years out of 8. And then they grew alfalfa there for 6 years, pulled that phosphate out, and came back in and put manure on again, got the phosphate up high, but you in a matter of 6 years using growing corn silage 2 years and alfalfa 6 years, they could get that phosphate back out of that soil so that they could put manure on it again. I'm not going to say that we can do that for everything because they actually expanded their operation so that now they've got more acreage to put on that corn. They can put more on the corn silage. And now, if they can't use it all because it's too much, they're willing to let somebody else use it, and there's enough people around that they can now find somebody that'll take that manure. Everybody wants high yields. Everybody wants high grass quality and high forage quality. But the question then is, at what price? To stay within a budget, where do you start? Most people will have a budget, but you know what I find with a lot of pasture people is their budget is nitrogen and then it's over with. Because they think, oh, there's enough manure that'll take care of the rest of it. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. Can take care of some things, but others you can't. So I asked the question, what gets you by, or what keeps you going? If you look at what gets you by, you're never going to correct your soils. That's just a matter of, well, what do we do to grow this yield? What you do to grow a yield doesn't mean you're achieving your top potential. It doesn't mean you're achieving your top nutritional values either. Who samples pastures? You know what? Most of the clients that I have when you first start talking to them, they're not interested in sampling their pastures. They want to sample their corn and their beans and their wheat and their alfalfa. But pastures? Why sample a pasture? We got all this, you know, the cows in there. We're going to have manure and so forth. So many people will say, I haven't sampled my pastures and never thought about it. Well, there's one thing that happens, especially in terms of dairy pastures from time to time. Maybe you don't experience, but I expect there's going to be somebody in the room that has. And that is, if you keep all your cows on a small acreage of pasture and bring in the feed to feed them, as that continues, the potassium and sodium in those soils just keep going up higher and higher and higher. And when the potassium and sodium finally gets high enough that the cows eating that grass start getting more potassium, sodium in their bloodstream than calcium and magnesium, when the potassium, sodium exceeds the calcium, magnesium, the cow's going to die. And guess which one die first? The best milker, best replacement heifers? The ones that are the best. And what's happening? The sodium and potassium getting so high in that grass, if you dare to go out and taste it, you'd probably find it is so bitter you wouldn't want to eat it. But when that's all the green there is, which cow's going to get it? If that's all the green there is, it's going to be your best milker. It's going to be the ones that has the ability to get everybody else out of the way. And if a veterinarian comes out and checks that cow, he'll say, but your cow wasn't sick. It didn't have a disease. What happened was, unless you did a blood analysis, you wouldn't find it. But when you do a blood analysis, you'd find the potassium and sodium is higher than the calcium and magnesium. It would do the same to us, except we get sick enough, we go to the doctor before, and those cows can't do the same thing. What I would tell you is we find this, I mentioned this in a presentation in South Dakota years ago, and the guy came and he said, I have checked all my crops for 20 years and used the Albrecht program, gotten good results, but he said, I never checked the pasture. And he said, it wasn't my best milker, it was my new heifers that were coming in. And he said, they started dying. And then my best milkers started dying. He said, cows just kept dying, and they said, your cows are not sick. He said, I finally just sold out my whole dairy. And he said, I'm glad I came to this meeting because now I got beef cattle on those same pastures. And he said, I still never checked them. He said, I'm going to go home and check those pastures. What you'll find is, in so many cases in pasture, the phosphorus and potassium go up really high and the calcium just keeps going out and down and down. Because what happens when you get an accumulation of manure in an area? Well, you get an accumulation also of nitrogen, and when that nitrogen converts to nitrate, it either is going to get picked up by a plant or it's going to leach away. And when that leaches away, your neighbor state here did some studies in the 1990s. What happens to nitrate when it leaves the soil? First studies I'd ever seen done on it, because most people said, well, when you put nitrogen, it can't take calcium out because nitrate doesn't take out calcium. All right. I said, I don't know that. All I know is when we have clients who use too much nitrogen, the calcium levels go down faster. About twice as fast if you use 50% more nitrogen than you need. Well, now all of a sudden, University of Wisconsin Ag Research Service did research back in the 90s, and they found that nitrogen doesn't go out as nitrate out of the soil. 85% of that nitrate converts to nitric acid before it leaches out, and nitric acid has an affinity for calcium. It latches onto the calcium, just strips it out of there. To the extent you overuse nitrogen, you're going to start stripping out calcium, and if you don't know to go back and replace it, then that's going to be a downfall to nutrition in pasture. Who samples pastures? Well, controlled grazing. It's not unusual to have someone to pull samples on that, but many times even on that we find that there's a tremendous difference where a person comes in and just starts sampling. So, but controlled grazing, we don't have trouble convincing some of those fellows to do it. If you're going to grow hay, well, maybe. In terms of hay production, it depends on whether it's actually just giving it away or whether it's trying to produce it for your own livestock and so forth. But if you're growing hay, it's a good idea to take a look and see what your nutrient values are, because you can change that in a year or two, if not less. Permanent pastures, most people just don't sample their permanent pastures. And if they do, it may be to say, well, this is not a good pasture, so it's not doing good. What can we do to make it better? But if you think you got good pasture already, so many people think, what's the need of sampling? Everybody wants high-yielding, high-quality grass and forage, but again, at what price? To stay within the budget, What do? You can't manage what you can't measure. First of all, find somehow that you can measure what you need. I don't know any other way to tell except by doing soil tests with somebody. Find you somebody you can trust, somebody that will help you with it, and start to see, well, if you got a good area and it seems to be going the best, and you got another area that's not doing as well, take a look at what the differences are in terms of nutrients that are there. That's at least one way you can start with anybody. An accurate soil test is always dependent upon taking a sample properly. On pastures, we say take a 4-inch sample. Now, in this particular soil right here, when you see that soil gather up on the end of the probe, that's a heavy red clay and it has extreme magnesium excess. Not all soil will react the same way with extreme magnesium, but in this case, the big question is if it's the least bit wet, you're not going to take 4 inches. If you push that probe in, it's going to jam it all together. You're going to get more than that. So we say wait until it's dry enough, and in this case, this probe had to be driven in with a 3-pound lead-weighted mallet because the soil's hard enough to get 4 inches down. The higher the magnesium in the soil, the harder that soil is going to be. And there'll be a lot of people that'll disagree with that, but with GPS now, it's easy to prove. You get a pasture that has the same calcium level over the whole area, but the magnesium levels go from excellent down to extremely high, and you can pick it out. I've had an 8-year-old boy from the fellow that was with me that took a probe, and he could tell it. When he walked from one of those, we just took a handheld and would walk from one zone to the other, say, how does that feel? And first one had the right magnesium. He said, that's easy. It was between 10 and 12. We got into the next one, had about 14% magnesium. That 8-year-old boy could tell the difference. When he pushed it in, he said, that's harder. And when we got to the ones that had the 18, 19% magnesium, he said, that's really hard. What I'm saying is, you can tell. What you have to have is talk apples and apples, or get the same calcium percentage, but then have the variation in terms of the magnesium. That particular pasture incident was being converted to become a vineyard. Okay, always follow sampling instruction provided by the laboratory you're going to use. Because different ones look at them different ways. But we tell our clients, if you're going to sample a pasture or a hay meadow, all the fertilizers going on top, sample it 4 inches deep. If you want to know what's below that, then take another subsoil sample or whatever. And I encourage people, if you don't think that's right, I encourage people to do it, because then you can see how little influence putting that on top has below that 4 inch depth. The second year, third year, fourth year, as long as you care to sample it. Eventually that will move down. Now, we're not talking about anions like nitrate, sulfate, borate. They're going to move through the soil. You're going to lose those. You got to keep up with those. We need to be looking at sulfur and boron just like we look at nitrogen. Make sure we got enough every year, because they leach out. And we find a tremendous amount of soil that have extremely deficient sulfur and extremely deficient boron. Nitrogen, people don't generally have trouble because they know they need to put some nitrogen back, but they don't really connect the other two with it. 4-inch sample, whether it's sand, whether it's clay, if you're going to put everything on top, take a look at what that needs and model your program after that 4 inches. Whatever's down below that, just look and see how long it takes to influence it. The other thing that I'd tell you is be careful when you pull a sample if the cattle are out on the pasture. And I'm going to give you an example. In this case, it's not a pasture, it's a hay meadow. But we were doing some work with a group of Mennonites in southwest Missouri and had worked with them for several years. And this one fellow had a little 10-acre alfalfa patch. And the north side was the highest, the south side was lowest. So we go in and split that in two, because the high side is going to have less fertility than the low side. Is it going to be enough to make a difference in terms of fertility? For the first 3 years, the recommendations were completely different for the top side versus the low side, because the low side had more P and K than the top side did. All right. Now we got it to the point where basically it needed the same thing, so we combined the whole thing together, pulled samples there for 2 or 3 years. And then one year I came and the guy said, well, one of our neighbors devised a new spreader and we can spread a ton of turkey compost to the acre. And we've been doing that on all of our alfalfa. But he said that little patch right out behind the house there, where I tied that piece of plastic on the barbed wire, we got rained out right there. He said, the south side got a ton of compost, north side hadn't gotten any. We hadn't gotten back there to put the rest on. And he said, the reason I'm telling you, if you see a little fleck of compost or something in that south side, you might want to not take a probe there. So I go out. Now, he's still thinking we're going to put the whole thing in one sample. But when we did soils, we always charged by the acre because every farmer thought we pulled too many samples. If he's paying by the acre, he knows we're going to pull those samples because we think we ought to, not because we want more money. Well, we went out there and I said, well, it's right about the same spot. We'll just sample it north and south like we had before. When we got the samples back, the north side looked just like we expected it to. The south side, the P and K was sky high. And when I went out there to pull those samples, I looked, and if I could see anything that looked like it might be some compost, I didn't pull a sample there. But just that little bit, a ton of compost that had been put on 2 or 3 weeks earlier with an inch of rain on it, still threw off that sample. What do you think's going to happen with those cows walking through the field, getting manure in between their hooves and so forth? You think we're going to be able to go out there in a pasture and make sure we don't pull it where that extra fleck of manure would be? What we tell our clients is, if you're going to have a time when the cattle are off the pasture, wait until just before you're going to put them back on there again, and then go take your samples. And you know what? We'll see samples go from extreme P and K to deficient P and K just because of the way it was pulled. So manure, fresh manure for sure, but at least when you can see where the manure is and the urine spots and so forth, that's a much better time to pull that sample. Same thing when you go through and somebody spreads all through there and you got cattle manure all over the place, what kind of chance is we're going to get a really good sample out of that doesn't have a contamination to have high P and K there? Wait as long as you can. I put this in to say fertility matters, and what am I talking about? Look at all this right here, but look right down on the other side of this fence. Down here should have more of this problem than up here, except here they corrected the fertility, and here they have not. I wish I were up here to attend your weed conference, because this is one thing that I've really contended for a long time, and that is if we could find out what's causing those weeds to be in there, we could do several other things besides going out there and just having to spray them all to kill them.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I won't be here, but if you put it on on something that can be sent, I'm interested in buying it.
For sure.
But here's what we find. I mean, in terms of areas where we have really high sodium, we'll get this old salt grass. You come in there and correct the calcium, which will drive the sodium down, and all of a sudden you don't get the same growth there. If you've got problems with something and then come in and correct it, this is a different kind of example, but it's one of the best ones I know. When I started right where we live in southeast Missouri, we live in heavy, sharky clay, we call them gumbo soils. And every farmer raised soybeans on every acre on 365,000 acres in what we call the spillway. They raised soybeans every year. They had raised soybeans on there for between 20 and 40 years every year and never spent a dime on fertility. But almost every one of them were just barely scraping by. They said, we got to have a bunch of acres because we just can't make any money. They were making about an average, a bad year would be 28 bushel, a good year would be 32 bushel. On average, they made 30 bushels a year, not putting on any fertilizer, any lime, anything. Heavy, sharky clay soils. The only way to get that nutrient, the only way to get those yields up was put on what was lacking in the soil, and you could change those from 30 bushels to 45 bushels in 1 year. And nobody was doing it because they thought pH is too high. We can't add lime. Our pHs on our farm and the others there were in the high sevens. Well, somewhere as low as 7.3 or 7.4. But everybody said, your pH is high enough, you don't need lime. Until I met Dr. Albrecht. And Dr. Albrecht said, don't look at the pH, look at your percentages. When we looked at the percentages, they were down in the 50s. We corrected the percentages, getting them up into the 60s. 1 year, a ton of lime and a ton of gypsum. That's all it took. Now, I'm not saying that's what it'd take on your farm, but in our area there, that's what it took. But do you think anybody would change the recommendations after that happened? Only the people who saw it happen. That's all. Because that just went against what was written in all the books. Dr. Albrecht always said, study nature, not books. If you can get a response, what caused that response? He knew what caused the response. But fertility matters, and in this case, on those soybeans, guess what happened? Every farmer, the plague that he had was cockleburs and foxtail. Now, I grew up before Randox, which was Monsanto's first thing that we found that we could put on in the row and kill out all the foxtail. Boy, when that came, we thought we'd gone to heaven, because now we could make more soybean seed than we could pounds of foxtail seed. But another thing happened. All of a sudden, the cockleburs stopped growing. And the key about the cocklebur in our area, when I was growing up, we had to use machetes and go out and chop the cocklebur out of the soybeans, because there wasn't, if you couldn't plow them and cover them up fast enough because it was too wet, they wouldn't get taller than the beans, just higher than your head. We'd go out there with machetes and cut them out of 300 acres of beans. All of a sudden, when we corrected that soil, the cocklebur, I'm not saying you didn't have any, but it wasn't a plague. It was maybe one here and one there and one there. And one time I was making a presentation in a meeting, and I said, well, you know, when you correct the soil, every plant will grow better. One of the guys raised his hand and he says, Neal, okay, you saying every plant will grow better, our soil don't grow cockleburs anymore. I said, if every plant will grow better, why aren't we still growing better cockleburs than we used to? And I said, well, let's just say all of a sudden somebody discovered that the oil in a cocklebur seed cures cancer. Everybody wants to grow cockleburs to sell it so they can get the oil out to kill cancer. I said, you know what you'd have to do to grow those cockleburs? You'd have to do the same thing you're doing to grow anything else. What we did was we took away the advantage that cocklebur had in those soils. Cocklebur will grow in a low calcium, low zinc soil. When we supplied the calcium and the zinc, they didn't have an advantage anymore. Now, if you could get the soybeans up tall enough to actually shade them out, didn't have a problem. So everything look to see where do you give the advantage, and you know what we find? If it's a food or a fiber crop, generally the ideal balance gives those crops the advantage. Not the weeds and not other things. The things that are not really that valuable for food don't grow as well in the same soil that grows really the best food. Now, you can take that for what it's worth. But what I'll tell you is I should be talking about grass instead of cockleburs and soybeans. So let's get back to hands-on agronomy. Came out in 1993. I got a call from a fellow in Australia in 1994, and he said, Neal, I grow grass-fed beef on 4,000 acres. And he said, I read your book, I'm going to send soil samples to you. And I said, well, you may just want to send a few, because I asked him, well, how many are you going to send? Well, I'm going to send some from all my property. I said, you may just want to send a few and see what you need before you send all of them. No, I'm going to send them all. So he sent samples, and we made the recommendation, got back to him. I got a phone call one day, and he said, Neal, I can't afford this. I said, that's why I suggested that you might want to run a few samples first, see what it took. But you know what he did, and I talked a little about this morning, but I didn't talk about what I'm going to tell you now. He came in and just took 10% of the acreage he was taking out of pasture that was putting in grain and treated that. Well, the grain yields went up, but on his wheat, which was the basic crop that he put there for grain, on his wheat, in 2 years, the protein went from 11% to 14%. And he said, that gets me an extra $35 a ton for my wheat. All of a sudden, this program doesn't look as expensive as it used to. Well, after 2 years on the program, the third year, he planted it back in grass, and guess what the cows came to eat? Where he had put the fertility on. And he called me back and he said, I've got to do this everywhere. Well, he feeds Hereford steers. He buys them at 600 pounds. He doesn't grow the calves. He buys them at 600 pounds and feeds them out to 1,200 pounds. When he started, he said, it takes me 15 months to put on that 600 pounds. And he said, they tell us we have excellent dress out at 37% dress out. For grass-fed beef, he said, they say you can't do any better than that. After 5 years, he called and said, we're down to 12 months. But he said, Neal, I don't know if you know what this means or not, but he said, that 37% dress out, we're up to 39%. He said, that made me an extra $35,000, just like that. And he said, then after a few more years, and still today, he said, now it takes 10 months to get on that 600 pounds, and we get 41% dress out. And he said, for grass-fed beef, they say you can't do that. But he said, when you go in and do this, he said, when you start making presentations, tell people to do everything at once. I said, now, Paul, you know what happened with you in that. I said, we can't tell them that. He said, no, I don't mean tell them to do all the acres. I mean do everything you're supposed to do. I said, well, you did that. He said, well, I really didn't. He said, I didn't tell you this, but he said, all those trace elements you said put on, it was about the third or fourth year before I started doing that. But he said, that's what seemed to make such a difference. He said, tell people, don't wait on the trace elements. Put them on there as soon as you can. So I've told you for what it's worth. But Paul is a great client. Not only that, but between Paul and a friend of his, Rob, and one of Paul's brothers, now in that particular area of New South Wales, Australia, one of those three win the dry land wheat yield every year. All three of them are on the program, and like Paul said one time, it ought to tell people something. But he said, you know, people don't ask. We had a tour from New Zealand and went to his farm. The farmers from New Zealand went over there and went to his farm because he'd been on the program for a dozen years or so. It's dead of winter. Wheat's green, but all the pastures are brown until you get to his 4,000 acres. It's all in one square. His pastures were still green, right up to the fence line. One of the guys from New Zealand said, well, what about your neighbors? He said, they just say I get more rain than they do. He said, right up to the fence line? But he said, in all those years, he said, not one neighbor has ever come and asked me what I'm doing. Now, it might have had to do with they thought he had a real advantage over the rest of them. He was a bachelor, and they thought he had all the money. He could do whatever he wanted to with his money. But what he would tell you is he started spending less and making more. Soil test, consider calcium and magnesium to build soil life. We talked about that this morning. I'd like to take a look at, here is a pasture that we have permission to go ahead and use, so it's not something that we just took on our own, but I'd like to start out with the top portion of it. What do we look at first? When a soil, what would I say, what do I look at first when the soil comes back? I don't look at the pH. I look at these numbers right here and see how close are they in the ranges that are expressed. And these ranges doesn't mean if you're at 60, well, that's all right no matter what soil you've got. Or if you're at 70, that's all right no matter what soil you've got. Same thing for magnesium. The high calcium and the low magnesium is the things you look at for heavy clay soils. The high magnesium and the lower calcium is what you look at on sandier soils. Because as I said this morning, we need more magnesium in sand to reduce the pore space and even to attract and hold more water. Well, this next thing we look at is the exchange capacity, and this is a sandy soil, 4.4, and when you get below 5.2 exchange capacity, you have to take a completely different approach about how you look at calcium magnesium on sand. Because from 5.2 down to 4.12, you have to keep on reducing the calcium value from 250 down to 200 in order to not to go above 20% on the soil. And it's more important not to go above 20% until you get down to 200 pounds of magnesium. When you get to 200 pounds of magnesium and it goes above 20%, more important to have the 200 pounds of magnesium. That's anywhere from an exchange of 4.16 down to 3.2. When you get down below 3.2, then we have to actually adjust, because for most normal cropping, a 3.2 or lower sand can't hold enough nutrients to grow the crop. So then we've got to start taking a look at, all right, what do we do to take care of the soil, and then how much extra do we have to add in order to get the tonnage that you're wanting to produce there. And first thing I'll tell you is, sandy soils do not have to be worse than clay soils in terms of yield. We've got some farmers who will tell you when they started with us, their sand started out yield of what they call their good land because they could correct those first. It takes a lot less to correct sand than it does a clay that's out of kilter or something. So as a consequence, we'd have guys that say, my old sandy fields actually out-yielded my good fields. Well, their good field just hadn't been brought up to top production yet. So in terms of exchange capacity, we just want to know what it is so we know how to work with it. And then the next thing that we show here is, all right, what kind of desired calcium magnesium do we need? At a 4.4, that's a 60-20. We need 60% calcium, 20% magnesium. Well, in this soil, we got 64 calcium. We got too much calcium already. But we don't have 20% magnesium, it's 17.14. We need to up our magnesium and at the same time decrease our calcium. Well, guess what? If you go in there and just put on magnesium, don't put on calcium, for every percent that magnesium goes up, calcium coming down 1%. It works that way. So all we need, if we build that, we put on enough magnesium to get from 17 to 20, that's going to reduce that calcium by about 3%. That gets it real close to that 60-20. Just putting magnesium on this soil to get it up to 20% is going to make a big difference in terms of grass production. This is exactly the kind of problem a lot of the pastures in New Zealand have. They just don't have enough magnesium. You put the magnesium on there, all of a sudden the nitrogen works better and the phosphorus works better. To me, this is a great soil to have to work with, and it's an ideal soil to have to explain, because a lot of soils is not this simple. A lot of times you have to calculate. If you add that calcium magnesium together and it total less than 78 between the two, that means when you put on calcium, you're also going to have to put on magnesium. Or when you put on magnesium, you're also going to have to put on calcium, because otherwise, whichever one you don't put on is going to be deficient. That's the key about knowing what to do here. How much magnesium do we have to put on? How much calcium do we have to put on? In this case, we don't need to worry about the calcium. If we take care of the magnesium, calcium is about going to take care of itself. Potassium, 2 to 5%, we got 6.96. On sandy soil, that 2 to 5 can be very short. And so we'll look at the bottom half in a minute in terms of, is that enough potassium or not? At least the sodium's above 0.5. That means with sodium above 0.5, the cow that eat, or whatever livestock you've got, will eat a lot less salt. As soon as that drops below 0.5, they'll start consuming a lot more salt. The lower it goes, the more salt they're going to want. We'll have clients, we had one farmer last year that called and said, I just want you to do for me what you did for the neighbor. Well, what was that? He said, well, used to his stock ate as much salt as mine, but now he's half the amount mine does. And he said they stopped when he corrected the soil. All we did was bring the sodium up above 0.5%. If you're looking at pasture, the first things we'd tell you to look at is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. Now, sulfur should be right on the same plane as phosphorus when you're looking at a pasture. And the reason, actually it should be on any crop, but the reason we say that is when you start looking at how much phosphorus does it take for growing plants, if you analyze basically all food plants in the world, the phosphate level will be somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4% of the total makeup of the plant. Well, guess what sulfur is? 0.2 to 0.4. It takes just as much sulfur on average as it does phosphorus to grow a plant. Some will be vegetable, generally take more sulfur and less phosphorus. Grass, depending on what kind of grass it is, some may take more phosphorus than sulfur. But what we'd tell you is that sulfur level at 3 parts per million, 20 is the minimum. 20 is the absolute minimum. Ideal is 50 or above. 50 parts per million or above. And if you don't add sulfur year to year to year, sulfur leaches away. So now notice we've got sulfur 90 to 92%, 100 pounds per acre. That's to get you to 50 parts per million. In the fine print over to the side, apply a minimum of 40 pounds per acre. That's to at least get you up to the minimum of 20 parts per million. When your budget's limited, at least we want to give you some options so that you don't say, well, I can't afford that much sulfur, so I'm just not going to put any on. Sulfur's going to make a difference for you in this case. Now, when we start looking at the phosphorus there, desired value of 500, does that mean what it has to be? Dr. Albrecht used to always point out, if you want to grow the biggest leaf and the best grass, you need some reserve phosphate. It needs to be between 500 and 750 P2O5. So in this kind of a case, when we look at this, we're looking at 500 being more or less something to shoot for. That's the low side of excellent. The value found of 285 on that sand, that'll be shown as more than enough to be at least above the minimum desired phosphate level. But if you say, well, you know, all I want to do right now is get above the minimum, then yes, we could back off that phosphate. But if you don't put that on, you're going to keep going down. Measure and see what happens. Because if the comments that I keep hearing is, okay, we can just stimulate the organisms in the soil and so forth, and we don't really have to worry about putting fertilizer on to grow a crop. I'm going to tell you this principle you can count on. You can grow crops without fertilizer, but you can't grow crops without fertility. And as long as your soil has enough fertility there, you can keep on growing those crops. But you watch and see what happens in so many cases. The farmers that decide they can quit, they don't stop when they're down to the place where they ought to know they're in trouble. They start blaming the seed or the weather or something, and generally they get 5 or 6 years in, and by that time it's a costly thing to bring it back out again. Don't get caught in that trap. Do your soil test, and if you decide, hey, I'm not going to put on any fertilizer this year, I'm going to use whatever this program is. Measure your tests beforehand, come back about a year later, measure them again. Do that every year for 4 or 5 years and see, am I gaining, am I staying even, or am I getting less? I have had sugar beet growers that we've told, you don't need any phosphorus or potassium and you can grow an excellent crop of sugar beets. They left the P and K off and the beet yields went up and the sugar went up. Same thing with fodder beet. Same thing. The fodder beet that I showed on the dairy cow a while ago. On one 1,500 acre sugar beet grower, we did that for 10 years. His levels didn't go down. His yields went up because he had so much P and K there, it was tying up other nutrients. Well, after the 10th year, the grower said, now, when it gets down to the high side of excellence, that's where I want to be. So when we get there, you tell me how much I need to put on to stay there. That was about the 10th year. For some fields, the potassium got there the 7th year. But for the most part, on this 1,500 acres, he told a group of agronomists at a meeting that he had me come and speak at, he said, the amount of fertilizer we saved on this program in 5 years was 1 million Deutschmarks. He said, we would have put that much fertilizer on that Neal said we didn't need. But you know, then it finally got to that 10th year, and we made the recommendations, this is what you need to stay where you are. That was the year when he decided to retire. And his oldest son took over the operation. And his oldest son never had time to come to a meeting or learn anything. They had other businesses and he was running those, and he really didn't know that much about the agriculture side. But he did know one thing, we hadn't put on any fertilizer for 10 years, we still made a good crop. so they didn't put that fertilizer on. Well, they made a good crop because they were at the high side of excellent. The next year they didn't put on fertilizer again, and incidentally, they didn't send samples over here anymore because they were in Germany, so they started using a local lab. 5 years later, they had a crop disaster. The yields weren't there, and they said, oh, it was Neal Kinsey and the Albrecht program that caused that problem. It was not putting on fertilizer when you finally got down to the point you didn't have enough fertility to grow what you needed to grow. You can measure that on a soil test. Watch and see where you are. If you think you're going to do something like that, don't just go out there and blindly do it. Take tests and measure from somebody's lab. And when you see those numbers start going down, it's time to do something about it, especially if you get down to the minimums. Okay, in terms of phosphate there, what I'd tell you, you don't want to get any lower than that on phosphate. At least put on a maintenance level, which is about what that is. 150 pounds of 1152 will about keep you where you are. That's not an amount to build the levels up. And on pasture, we don't know how much livestock, we don't know if you're using controlled grazing or just 1 cow per 2 acres or whatever it might be. So there's going to be a certain amount of manure on the first year in. We're not going to say, well, you need to do this to build phosphate levels way up. Let's wait and see what happens. After a year or two, if the numbers are still going down, I don't think they'll go down in that case. They'll just stay where they are. But that's not going to get you the biggest leaf on your grass. Bottom side of the product here, well, notice for calcium, we got too much already, so we say none. But then it's going to take about 275 pounds of K-mag or Sopomag in order to supply that 30 pounds of magnesium. All we got to do is supply that 30 pounds of magnesium. It's going to pull the calcium down. Now, how fast is it going to do it? It's going to take about 12 months. But it's going to work really quick because that magnesium in K-mag or Sopomag works real quick. If you're doing it for dolomite, it's a completely different story. We'll talk about that a little later. But then as far as potassium, desired value 257, value found 239. Is 239 pounds of potassium enough to grow the tonnage you want? If you want 4 tons of grass there, look up and see how much potassium does 4 tons of grass take. Well, you don't want to take up that whole 239 pounds, but remember, at 275 pounds of K-mag or Sopomag, we're putting potassium on as well as magnesium and sulfur. So we're going to raise that potassium by more than the 18 pounds, and the thing there is, once the magnesium gets raised up, then we're going to have to revert back and start saying, all right, you need to use some other potassium in order to keep that level there. And as long as we recommend that you put enough to stay where you are, as long as that's enough to grow the tons you want, then that works out fine. And you can get charts that show you that. I don't have that in my head. As far as the desired value for sodium, and it shows a 7-pound deficit, remember we said up there it was above 0.5. Don't worry about putting that on as far as what we'd tell you until you drop below 0.5. Boron is half what it ought to be. It takes 2 pounds. It takes 1 pound of boron to build that boron by 0.1 part per million. That's just the way boron tests are run. And so what we're doing there is we're recommending 15 pounds of 14.3% boron. That adds 2 pounds of boron, which will get from 0.44 to 0.64. But we want to be at 0.8. It's just that if you're growing legumes and when it says pasture, we don't know if it's already established pasture or if you're going to come in there and just start a pasture. If you're going to start a pasture and you want legumes, you don't want to put on more than 2 pounds of boron if you're going to do that at planting, because legumes have an affinity for boron. They'll suck it up to the point they'll kill themselves. And you can get by with 2 pounds of boron, but if you put 3 on there, you have 3 cool, damp days in a row while that's trying to grow. Between the time it sprouts and germinates and the time it reaches the first trifoliate leaf, it'll just suck in the boron. If it's there, it'll take as much and it'll kill it. So once it gets past the first trifoliate leaf, then you can come back and add more boron. So in those kind of cases, what we're trying to do is be careful. And with the footnote D there, it says apply 1 1/4 pounds of soluble as a foliar up to 4 times during the growing season. Unless you can come back and put more boron on, and if you have that ability to do that, that's going to at least get us up to almost 0.8. The iron and the manganese are in good shape there. Copper is in good shape there. The thing that's most lacking, and sand, you don't want this. You want that zinc level to be at above 6 parts per million, and the zinc should match up to the phosphate level. Since we have minimum phosphate, we want minimum zinc. Minimum zinc 6 parts per million. 15 pounds of zinc sulfate will improve the ability of your pasture grasses to take up water. Zinc is necessary for moisture absorption into a plant. And we'll have clients who will say, oh, it gets so dry where we are, we have to feed hay in July and August. And everybody in that area does it. One fellow came and to a meeting, and he said, I just grow cattle, all I got is pasture. He said, I just came with my neighbor, I really don't believe in soil tests. When it was over, he came back and he said, I'm going to send you some soil tests. And he sent the samples, and his big micronutrient deficiency was zinc. He had enough potassium. Potassium is the first key to moisture upstream. You need potassium to get the uptake of water. Potassium is a poor man's irrigation. That's you can count on that. If you are looking at getting more water into a plant, getting enough potassium there is the first key. But once you get the potassium above 2%, then you want to have that zinc above 6 parts per million. Because zinc is necessary for moisture absorption. That guy sent samples the next year, and a letter was in with it. And he said, guess what? We put on everything you said put on, including the zinc. And he said, our grass stayed green all the way through July and August. We didn't have to feed any hay, and every farmer around us still had to feed hay. Because they were wasting the water that was coming because they didn't have enough zinc to get it in. If your zinc level is, if you're a turf grass grower that has a zinc level of 3 parts per million, and remember when you're taking off turf grass, you're taking soil along with the grass, and when you take the top 2 inches of soil is the highest in P and zinc, both phosphorus and zinc. So when you take that off, you're actually pulling zinc away, and if you don't come back and put it on there, I've had turf grass growers that say, we can water the grass, and you walk out there and the ground's still wet and the grass is already twisting. We have to water again. Generally, that's when the zinc will be 3.0 parts per million or less. You come in there and put the zinc on, and I mean in 2 or 3 days. In 2 or 3 days, it'll change that fast. For grass and forage growth, consider NPK and S needs first. To grow the crop, that's a good idea. These are the ones that can make the most difference as long as they are deficient or needed. Too many people just keep on saying, well, we're afraid not to put it on. Once you get enough, then start looking at what else is limiting you. Don't know what they say in Michigan. I didn't take time to look this up, but University of Missouri says if you can grow 1/3 legumes in your pastures, that's enough legumes to supply the nitrogen for your legumes and your grass. 1/3 legumes, you don't need to worry. Nitrogen's not your limiting factor if you've got anything else missing. All right? In terms of that, looking at 1/3 legumes, there's one other question, and that is, how much nitrogen is that 1/3 legume putting in? Now, you know, you'll find a lot of difference of opinion on this, but basically for coastal Bermuda hay, they'll tell you it takes 500 pounds of nitrogen from somewhere to grow 10 tons of coastal Bermuda. 500 pounds, take 50 pounds per ton. Now that, you take off what you got in terms of what the legumes could supply, you take off what the humus can supply, and then put the rest on. As far as regular grasses and so forth, 40 to 50 pounds per ton of grass. That's generally what will work out. And what we'll say is the soils that don't have the right nutrients, 50 pounds are probably closer to right. The soils that get the right amount of nutrients, 40 pounds will work. Does that bring back any ideas to you when you look at that? Oh, yeah. Potassium, as I said, potassium is the poor man's irrigation. 2% base saturation is the minimum needed. It's not how many pounds you have, it's the percentage of saturation. In the soils where I grew up, we had 700, 800 pounds of potassium and still had a potassium deficiency in our crops because that was less than 2%. Put on enough potassium, get it above 2%, then that's when you start taking care of the total potassium deficiency. Now, to grow the crop, does that mean if you're at 1% and that's say 1% is 500 pounds, you want to be at 2, that's another 500 pounds. Does that mean we got to supply that whole 500 pounds in order to grow a crop? You supply what pounds it takes to grow the crop. But that doesn't correct your soil. Until you correct the soil, we're still going to have problems with potassium deficiency. In terms of compost and manure, first comment I'd make is sample your compost and manure, and don't just take a sample that's 5 years old and say, well, that's what we're still getting. Compost and manure samples will vary. If you have 2 or 3 good years in a row, and you check the manure from your cattle or pigs or whatever, phosphate level will be good. If you have a real dry year, when you start feeding that corn to those pigs or to those animals, the phosphate level is going to drop in the manure. Because of a dry year, you don't get as much phosphate uptake in your corn or whatever it may be. So what we tell clients is check your manure from year to year to see what you're getting. Especially if you got lots you're going to put on, it's a good idea to at least have an idea for that year. Phosphorus, P2O5, 300 minimum, 500 is low side of excellence, 750 is the high side. When you get above 750, that's when you start having problems. As far as the phosphate test, does your P-test measure this correctly? That's Tennessee brown rock phosphate. Most phosphate tests, if you put that on, it won't show you did anything. Now, I learned this from working with organics, and that is, it won't show you did anything unless you do what Dr. Albrecht says, the kind of test you need to measure available phosphates. And that's a P2 test. When you measure that, what you'll find is for every 500 pounds of that soft rock you put on, it'll raise the calcium 100 pounds, and that'll show up in the calcium test, whatever. But if you're doing a water-soluble phosphate test, it'll look like you did nothing. If you're doing a root acid-soluble test, then you'll see that phosphate increases by 100 pounds per acre for every 500 pounds you put on. That is the key, what Dr. Albrecht used to always say. We don't want to know what's water-soluble. We want to know what's water-soluble plus what the exudates from the roots can dissolve and pick up. He said we need to know root acid-soluble as well as water-soluble in order to get the right phosphate reading. In terms of soft rock, we'll have organic growers that are saying, we just put on and put on and put on. We can't get any phosphate increase. As soon as you change the test, that's when it shows you what you got. Sulfur, 50 parts per million per acre. This is what we recommend for any livestock operation. Once you get the other nutrients there, sulfur at least 20, that's the minimum, but ideally 50 parts per million in order to get enough sulfur for your livestock. Calcium, 60 to 70%. Excess magnesium, well, magnesium needs to be 10 to 12%, or on the sand, up to 20%, based on the figure you get. Magnesium excess of 13 to 15%. This fellow has 4,000 acres that he grows sheep on, and he supplements magnesium on his soil because the soils are too high in magnesium. He started with us in 1996. Today, his soils aren't too high in magnesium. When the soil magnesium finally dropped below 12, those sheep quit eating magnesium. They quit eating free choice magnesium. He said it just stayed out there in the trough. Why is that? Because the plants finally are getting enough magnesium, and when they're eating the plants, they're getting enough magnesium. Magnesium, too much magnesium in your soil means you don't get enough into the plant. Now, when we're looking at sandy soils, too much magnesium is a completely different percentage than it is on medium. Any soil that has an exchange capacity above 8.7, if your exchange is above 8.7, you don't want more than 12% magnesium. Otherwise, it's going to get hard to get your magnesium into the plant. If you have a problem with pugging, take a look and see. The clients that we have that have the most problem with pugging are the clients that have deficiencies of magnesium. Ireland, Ireland and Northern Europe and parts of New Zealand, they'll get puggy and they'll say, when we corrected the magnesium, got our magnesium where it ought to be, all of a sudden we don't have the same problem. I'm not going to say you can't ever get too much tracking, but that pugging, when the magnesium is too deficient, the soil doesn't stick to the animal's feet. If you get pugging and it sticks to animals' feet, the magnesium's too high. It happens on either side. Are we time up?
Yeah.
I don't know for sure how. This is a good one to point out, and that is people say you can't get benefit from magnesium from dolomite lime until the second and third year. The plants get a benefit. This dolomite lime on the green side, dolomite lime was applied less than 6 months ago. That green is not because of the nitrogen, it's because of the magnesium that's getting into those plants. This side over here, they didn't get it on, they got rained out, and they hadn't gotten back to put it on yet. They didn't put nitrogen on, they put dolomite lime on. That magnesium starts getting out of that dolomite, and calcium has an effect on that too, admittedly, but you get it into the plants long before it shows up in the soil. So even though it takes, on a dolomitic limestone application, the first 12 months, if you do a soil test after 12 months, it looks like you didn't put any magnesium on at all. But the second 12 months, half of it becomes available, third 12 months, the other half becomes available. Grass tetany in excess of or deficiency of magnesium. If you have grass tetany, it's not because your grass is growing so fast in the spring that nitrogen's forcing too much growth. It's because of the magnesium deficiency. Magnesium deficiency in the plant. And we'll have clients that feed free choice magnesium because they have low magnesium in order to prevent grass tetany, but we also have clients that we have to feed, once the magnesium goes above 12, the higher it goes above 12, more magnesium that livestock is going to consume. And a valley in Wyoming where the conservation district had me come out and put on a meeting for them. And they said, Neal, we're going to send you some soil samples because in one end of the valley, they always get grass tetany. In the other end of the valley, they never have grass tetany. Well, guess what? The end of the valley where they got grass tetany had excess magnesium. The end of the valley where they didn't get grass tetany, the magnesium between 10 and 12. When you get the magnesium right, grass tetany won't be there. But in the meantime, feed free choice. John?
Neal, is that because the boron was available?
Is that because the boron's available?
Yeah, in order to get calcium into the plant, magnesium.
Well, we need boron to get the calcium in the plant, but we need calcium to get the magnesium in the plant.
Yeah,
Yeah. If you don't have, if you have an excess of magnesium and you're showing a deficiency, 5 pounds per acre of 11% magnesium sulfate will green it up, but you'll generally have to do it 4 or 5 times in order to get the magnesium level up where it needs to be. Don't do it any more often than every 3 to 4 weeks, because if you use Epsom salts more than that, it'll dry out your plants. Don't do it more than, wait at least 3 weeks time after time.
all right, Neal.
Okay, we've got to quit. All righty. Thanks very much, everybody.